Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History, Season 1, Episode 3, as we stay in the year 1984 for our opening month or so of a podcast here on our new show. Glad you could be with us. We hope you enjoyed the first couple of programs spotlighting 1984 with the Detroit Tigers, with Fred Heumann as our special guest, longtime Detroit personality in the Lansing area as well. And Steve Lansky last week helping us highlight the 1984 Edmonton Oilers, as that was a great franchise that started a great run in the NHL with their playoff run, including the 1984 Stanley Cup. Today, we thought we would do something a little different, kind of out of the ordinary as far as dominant teams that won championships, as we're going to take a look at the 1984 college football national champions. And again, 40 years ago, this was back before BCS and back before the college football playoff. It was the sports writers and it was the coaches. And again, it was kind of unusual, the run that this team had, but we're going to highlight the Brigham Young Cougars as they ran the table. They won 11-0. Lavelle Edwards' team won the national championship. We're going to take a look back at that unusual run and some of the other things that happened in college football that year. We're going to be joined by a special guest, the founder of 12 Ounce Sports, one of our sports historians and also a personality. He's got a show on Thursday nights called That Just Happened or What Just Happened. Jeff Beck's going to join us, and we'll dive into the Brigham Young Cougars, the 1984 national champions. We're going to do that right after this for 12 Ounce Sports and tickets.12ouncesports.com. Hi, everybody. Captain Lou here from 12 Ounce Sports in the Captain Lou Extravaganza. If you're like me, you like to go to ball games in person, don't you? Or a hockey game. Stanley Cup playoffs are in full swing. Your favorite NBA team in the second round of the playoffs, or maybe all the way to the top. Major League or minor league baseball, nothing like a Saturday night game at a ballpark. Well, your place to go is tickets.12ouncesports.com. Use the promo code 12ounce too, and you'll get a better discount. We are a ticket broker. We won't make you pay those fees that you'll see at some of those secondary markets. Tickets.12ouncesports.com. Can't say enough about it. It's where I go to get my last-minute tickets to go to a ball game on a Saturday night or any night during the week. Tickets.12ouncesports.com. I'm telling you, that is the place to go. Stanley Cup playoffs, NBA playoffs, Major League, minor league baseball, and more. That's tickets.12ouncesports.com. All right, everybody, welcome back to Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History. And again, we are focusing on 1984 here today as episode 3 of season 1. Glad you could be with us here tonight, as we said. And we're going to take a look at a national champion that really wasn't a dominant national champion, or a champion that may not have been a champion in a lot of people's eyes. And that's the college football national champion from 1984, the Brigham Young Cougars. And we thought we would bring in as a special guest someone who kind of remembers that back in the day, not quite as old as I am, but loves college football and a Big Ten aficionado like myself, the godfather of 12 Ounce Sports, Jeff Beck. Jeff, thanks for taking time out to be with us. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. When you call me the Godfather, I wish I had my cigar that I do on my Thursday night show, but I gotta thank you for having me on. I'm a little rusty. I haven't been on in a few weeks. The Thursday night show, we haven't been able to make it come together. And then I'm just noticing that hair is at a premium in this show right now.
Well, you know, it's just a sign of intelligence, Jeff. That's all it is. That's the way I look at it. So, but you know, we were talking earlier about our topic here tonight with the Brigham Young Cougars, the 1984 national champions. And it's crazy, you know, how 40 years ago is so much different than now. We could spend 3 hours talking about how the landscape of college football has changed. But Brigham Young is the last non-Power 5 national champion. I find that hard to believe.
40 years ago, and we could probably spend 30 hours on the ever-changing college landscape. You said something very telling in your intro that I think you said, I can't remember how you worded it. It was 2 minutes ago, but a lot of people didn't think they should have had a chance. I actually was doing some research this morning before I headed out to the golf course, and there was a lot of drama with BYU being selected to play Michigan because they had the 84th weakest schedule in the nation. They were 84th out of 110, and they had a lot of close scares. I wanted to talk a lot about the action in the stat box because I was 11 at the time. I remember watching the game. But not only did they have the 84th ranked schedule, they only beat Hawaii by 5. They only beat Wyoming by 3. And they opened the season against what was number 3 preseason Pitt and beat them by 6. But it turns out Pitt was overrated because they ended the season 3-7-1. So they had a terrible, terrible schedule, and they weren't blowing people out. So it was rather shocking that they were selected.
And the thing about it too is, we can fast forward real quick to the postseason, and this again was back before they had the BCS, the college football playoff that we've got now, and that whole setup. Oklahoma turned down an opportunity to play them in the Holiday Bowl because they wanted a more prestigious bowl game because the Brigham Young was tied into the Holiday Bowl because they were the conference champions.
Yeah, which is pretty wild. Two things about that. One, the excuse that writers had in the early 80s was they were the only undefeated college football team in the nation. So that's if you cut the modern day, that's a pretty weak argument for putting someone in. You could have a Troy or Western Carolina that played nobody that had 2 or 3 wins and went undefeated. So that's kind of a weak argument. And then you were talking about Oklahoma wanted to go to a different bowl. We grew up in the Wild West. I remember Nebraska would be in this bowl game. Michigan would be in this bowl game. If one of them won and one of them lost, then the winner would be the national championship. If they both won and it came down to writers deciding who's nobody thought back then, why don't we just have them play?
Right.
Didn't.
And, you're right. And, with Brigham Young, back then, I think it was the UPI and the coaches poll or the USA Today poll. I am stunned that they would vote an undefeated Brigham Young team in over some of these more established teams. And so it did make for an interesting year, but Jeff, the Cards everything fell into place for them with these teams that were ranked that fell, with Michigan at one time was ranked in the top 10, and then Ohio State never got the opportunity to play, but they weren't the best team. And I mean, they had a couple of losses. They technically were the best team in the Big Ten, but it was by all accounts a down year for them too.
Yeah. I think the stars align for BYU. What I find fascinating is 10 years later, this would have never happened. Yeah. Maybe even 5 years later. It literally was the perfect storm for BYU. Survive and advance every game. You're the only undefeated team in the nation, and you had enough writers out there that said, let's give them a chance. And then they end up winning the damn thing, beating Michigan. But I mean, even before BCS, before the playoffs, that was going to have to be the last time we ever saw that. I'm just convinced of it. And I remember even as 11, I was 11 when that game was played. I remember hearing people say, oh, well, this is going to open up new doors for the smaller schools. And it didn't. It shut the door pretty tight.
Boy, it sure did. And, you talked about how Brigham Young opened up the year with a game against the number 3 team at the time in the Pittsburgh Panthers. They had some great teams in the 70s. They came into that year, with some promise, but the Cougars beat them. So then they went into their next game against Baylor. And Baylor back then really, Jeff, wasn't a team that was, maybe considered as great or as they, are now. They've really enjoyed some success recently. But Brigham Young had a quarterback by the name of Robbie Bosco that started putting up some monster numbers. And he had one hell of a game against Baylor with almost 500 yards passing.
Yeah, 6 touchdowns in that game too. And they jumped all over Baylor. I think they were up, what I'm looking at it here, 34-7.5. Yeah, that's not the Baylor that we know.
No.
That's our grandfather's Baylor. They were kind of nobodies back then. But yeah, Robbie Bosco made a name for himself in that second game. And I think I did some research. I told you before I hit the golf course. I think he had 33 touchdowns, 11 interceptions that year. So game 2 really started sparking his good season.
You know, you mentioned some of the other, you know, the conference they played in, you know, the WAC wasn't exactly, it wasn't exactly the Big Ten or the SEC or anything like that. They played Tulsa and in the Rainbows of Hawaii. And I got to tell you, they were damn lucky to beat Hawaii that year. Glenn Kozlowski, I think he ended up playing for the Chicago Bears, if I'm not mistaken. But he had a big game, I think 9 catches for over 150 yards. And, you know, they started to establish themselves as a top 10 team. But it's just mind-boggling with playing that kind of and I don't want this to sound like we're, you know, digging on Brigham Young, but you look back to the schedule and then a close one against Hawaii.
I mean, I'm not really digging on them. I'm kind of laughing at the NCAA because it's we've heard all criteria, a resume, things like that our entire lives, and this seems like the one year, the one sport where everybody's like, who cares? Let's give them a shot, and they won it. So you got to give you take your hat off to them for winning it. But I'm looking at the Hawaii box score. In current day college football, even if you're undefeated, that Hawaii box score would have a lot of talking heads like, should they be in the title? I mean, it took everything they had to pull that game out 18-13. And that would kill, because we've had multiple undefeated teams in the same season. And a game like that has knocked a team out of the running.
Well, you know, getting back to, when they played right after they played Hawaii, I think they had an off game. But, you know, I look at I'm just looking at some of the games or actually maybe even that week. You look at Nebraska. They were number 1 in the country at that time, beat UCLA, who was ranked 8th. Then you had Clemson over number 20, Georgia on a 60-yard field goal. Then you had Texas playing in Miami playing. And then you got Ohio State pummeling Iowa. I mean, some big matchups early with ranked teams, and it just so much action even back then in the early part of the year.
You mentioned Washington turned down the Holiday Bowl. That might have been in the green room before we went live, but I wonder what happened to Washington in their bowl game. Do you have that in front of you that year? And did they had a loss, I take it?
Well, Washington, I'm looking at it right here. Washington, just scrolling down, they played in the Orange Bowl and they ended up beating Oklahoma, who Oklahoma was the one that turned down that game against BYU because they were number 2 in the country at the time. Washington was number 4. They played in the Orange Bowl, and USC played Ohio State in the Rose Bowl that year. And USC won that one by 3, which, you know, back then that was commonplace for the Big Ten to go to the Rose Bowl more often than not and get beat, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, you know that.
Oh, yeah. So what was Michigan ranked that year when they took the offer for the Holiday Bowl?
Well, Michigan was 6-5. And that was the thing that really got the ire of everybody at the end of the year. And Michigan was leading at halftime in that Holiday Bowl game against against BYU. And then BYU came on strong in the fourth quarter, I believe, and won that game.
Michigan was leading after the third quarter. They were down 10-7.5, but they took a 14-10 lead into the fourth quarter. I didn't know that about Michigan, so that cracks me up that so BYU got a chance. They're the only undefeated team in the nation. So, we're going to give you a chance. Oh, well, the number 2 team doesn't want to play in the Holiday Bowl, so we're going to give you a 6-5 team. They barely scrape out a win, and they still get crowned the national champion. Like, there was no better. This is the only year this could have happened for BYU.
And the funny thing is I look at the stats and I remember why I didn't go. I was staying with my aunt and uncle out in San Diego, out in El Cajon. It was the reason I was going to go out there to begin with was my alma mater had a chance to play in the California Bowl, that being Central Michigan, but we didn't go because it was only 50 degrees out.
Oof.
And it was a fluke day for San Diego. And the other crazy thing about this, Jeff, is that it was December 21st, and the number one team in the land is playing in a bowl game. It's before Christmas. And not only did they play in a minor bowl game, now they got to sit and wait for 10 days. Not that it mattered because they were the consensus number one, but it just, again, you hearken back to what it was like then compared to now, especially now because they're going to have opening round playoff games for college football on the 22nd of December. It's a fun way to look back and just kind of compare to what it used to be like.
And laugh. I mean, we're happy for the progress, but just laugh at how badly they used to botch things, and they still kind of do too. Just kind of it's not a non sequitur, but a side note. You mentioned the first round games this year. Apparently, the NFL was not happy about it because it's when they start scheduling Saturday games, so they loaded up that first Saturday of round one college games. Yeah. They loaded up the NFL schedule, and somebody said that was on purpose because they historically they crush every other sport.
Well, I think part of the reason too is the Christmas Day games for the NFL are on Wednesday this year, and they have to have 5 days in between games. So that's why they put those games on Saturday, the NFL. Like Saturday to Wednesday, because they do the Sunday to Thursday games. And ironically, it's also the 4 teams that are playing on that Saturday have to play on Christmas. So, yeah, they're playing like the 2 teams that are playing against the 2 games, they're going to switch opponents and play them on Christmas Day. I don't exactly know. I know Baltimore and Pittsburgh are involved, and I think Kansas City and the Raiders maybe. But, yeah, that's why they're going up against it. But it's just like I said, it is the landscape has changed so much from when Brigham Young won it. And, it was just a fluke year, the way it all happened.
I'll keep using the term perfect storm. And I think, maybe Lavelle Edwards being the coach, I don't know that, was he that well established at that point? I want to see his first. Well, yeah, he had been coaching 12 years by then.
Yeah.
Maybe that helped with the name recognition. I really just think it was a more. I think maybe the people voting, it was a more innocent look at college football. Like it was more nostalgic. They thought there was some kind of benefit to being undefeated. I don't know. It's a different time now. So many analytics go into the game now. They have all kinds of stats. They know the strength of conference, strength of schedule. Brigham Young should be thankful it was 1984, not 1994. And you said it before we started the show. It's the last non-Power 5 to win a title. And at the time it was the first in like 15 years. There hadn't been one for 15 years before that either. It's like they basically hit the lottery. I mean, now that you told me, because I didn't check Michigan's, I'm still laughing at that. They got to play a 6-5 team in the Holiday Bowl and then wait 2 weeks to see what everybody else did in their bowl games. It's almost comical.
Well, and it's funny is they were, back then, obviously, there was still only 10 teams in the Big Ten. Yeah. Michigan was 7th in the Big Ten. Wow. They lost to both Ohio State and to Michigan State that year. I remember both games. I mean, Ohio State barely beat Michigan, but they beat them. And I think Michigan lost to Michigan State 19-7 or something like that. So this definitely was not one of it. This was not one of Michigan's stronger teams, although they were quarterbacked by a young man by the name of Jim Harbaugh, but he still
never heard of him.
I know, right? Kind of an eccentric, but he was real quiet back then, I guess. But,
Yeah.
But the other kind of crazy thing, I look back on it, and 40 years ago there was a conference. You remember the Southwest Conference? They were still.
Oh yeah.
They were still going strong. Houston was the winner of that conference. Getting the Cotton Bowl bid against Boston College.
When did SMU get banned?
That was right about then, or it was right after that. Yeah.
I thought it was in the 80s. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the Southwest Conference was tough.
Oh, man.
Yeah, there was just so many teams. I want to see the 1984. I'm going to look it up. 1984 final you might even have it.
Yeah. But like the Southwest Conference back then, SMU was the top team, but they were ineligible because of what happened. They were tied with Houston, Houston might have beat them outright that year. Actually, that was before all the crap went down, or they found out about it. But you had TCU and Arkansas and Baylor, and Texas was still in the Southwest Conference. A down year for Texas. Again, to your point, the stars aligned, and it just was a crazy thing. But getting back to some of the players that played on that team, not to jump around everywhere, but one of the players that came out of that team was a lineman by the name of Trevor Maddich, and he was a first-round draft pick for Brigham Young.
Yeah, he went to the Patriots, 28th overall. If you watch as much football as we watch, that name well. And they actually had, of their 5 draft picks that year, 2 of them were offensive linemen. So they were definitely strong in that position. They had a quarterback we talked about earlier. But Trevor Maddich went on he had a great career.
Yeah, I think Robbie Bosco, he was a backup journeyman quarterback, I think, in the NFL. But I think he played for a bit with the Packers back in the mid-late 80s.
Yeah, and he was a junior in this season that we're talking about, and they stayed 4 years more often back then. So I didn't see where I can look him up before we go off air, but see where he was drafted. But I was looking up Trevor Maddich, and he played a good 11 years in the NFL off that BYU team, and he was a first-round pick. I'm wondering if BYU had any first-round picks prior to him.
Boy, I don't know if Jim McMahon was a number 1 pick for the Bears the year before. I'm not sure, but anyway,
he might. Yeah,
you're watching Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History here on 12 Ounce Sports, and we're brought to you as always by tickets.12ouncesports.com. And speaking college football this fall, if there's a game that you want to go to, you got to look no further than tickets.12ouncesports.com. We are a ticket broker. We've got the best seats, and we don't charge the fees that some of these other secondary markets charge. So make sure you go to tickets.12ouncesports.com. And, we had great seats available this year for the everything, the national tournament for college basketball, the Frozen Four. We've got Stanley Cup playoff tickets, you name it. That's tickets.12ouncesports.com. And again, joined by the godfather of 12 ounce sports, Jeff Beck. And Jeff, it's funny. We talked about draft picks and great players. In 1984, the Heisman Trophy winner was Doug Flutie. And he played in that Cotton Bowl game against Houston we were talking about. And not to get away from Brigham Young, but who can forget that pass the day after Thanksgiving that he had against Miami of Florida? Remember that?
The iconic Hail Mary. I can still picture it. We're aging ourselves now, but I can still remember that like it happened yesterday. And I loved Doug Flutie because I played quarterback, but I was 6 foot tall. So, anybody shorter than me that made it in the NFL, I was a big fan of. And they played Houston that year, you say?
Yeah, in the Cotton Bowl. They weren't ranked in the top 10. I'm just trying to look at. I think they were an independent that year. Now they were an independent. Actually, they were ranked number 5 at the end of the year.
Yeah, they ended 5. Yeah.
Yes, But at the time, the final regular season games that were actually, ironically enough, were Thanksgiving weekend. Brigham Young was number 1, Oklahoma was 2, Florida was 3, Washington was 4, and Nebraska was 5. And we talked about it earlier. Washington didn't go to the Rose Bowl because they got beat by USC. So their consolation prize was the Orange Bowl, which wasn't that bad of a consolation prize, And I mean, the Rose Bowl is the granddaddy, but if you can't go there, you still get what's called now a New Year's Six bowl game.
Well, in hindsight, if I bet Washington wishes they would have taken that Holiday Bowl invite, because I'm looking here. I pulled up another site. I have the final top 20 poll of that season. It's pretty wild. I mean, you have 8-5 Miami of Florida as number 18 in the nation. So it was definitely a different time. There was a lot of 3-loss teams in that top 20, a lot of 4, and SEC Big Ten heavy, but Washington probably wanted to play BYU. BYU's opponents in 1984 went a collective 61-85-3. Yes, we still had ties back then.
Yeah.
This says they were 96th amongst 98 Division 1A schools. When I said earlier they were 80 something out of 110, it probably factored in the 1 AA schools. But I'm thinking in the 80s and the 70s, it was more honorable to go to the Rose Bowl or the Orange Bowl than to go to the Holiday Bowl and try to get some kind of writer's title. I don't understand what Washington was doing. They should have taken that challenge.
Boy, you would have thought, but it's like you said, hindsight's 2020. And you talked about the schedule strength of Brigham Young a few times. And I looked down the schedule again. They had some easier ones towards the end of the year before the bowl game, but again, playing in Air Force seems like they're always tough. They don't win a lot of games, but they play everybody so difficult. They needed all of almost 500 yards passing, Brigham Young did, to beat Air Force. Bosco had 485 that game. And, we keep going back to it. How did they get to be 11-0, and how did they get to be number 1?
Yeah. I would be interested to see, I don't know where you can find the data 40 years later, but if they started the season or ranked, and I'm going to go to Pitt, I go to the Pitt game, they were not ranked preseason, BYU. So they beat the number 3 team, which we now know is a false ranking.
Yeah.
Because Pitt only won 3 games that year. That win jumped them immediately up to number 13. They spanked Baylor, and then they jumped into the top 10. So they basically beat a team that shouldn't have been ranked number 3 to get themselves in the top 10 or top 15. So if they played anyone else in the first game of the season, they would have probably not been ranked all year. They were leapfrogged into the top 15 because they beat Pitt, because all the writers thought, oh, this Pitt team's going to be great. They're the number 3 team in the nation. And then BYU beats them. That's pretty crazy to think about.
Well, and you brought up some great points. And then I'm going to use Michigan as an example. They ended up 6-6 with that loss to Brigham Young. They were ranked, I think, it says here they're ranked 14th. Then they beat Miami was number 1, and they lost to Michigan in week 2. So Michigan went all the way up to number 3. Then Michigan lost the next week to Washington, and then Michigan started their nosedive. And
wow.
It's back and forth. That's why it's so crazy. Iowa was 5th the 3rd week in the country. Then they lost to Penn State. It just back and forth you went, and it's just surviving that. And I guess that's probably why they were number 1, because they were consistent, even though they had a very insignificant schedule, if you will, in the WAC. So it's crazy.
Here's another. I find this wild because we are more influenced by modern times. If you barely beat Hawaii and you're Ohio State or Michigan, you're dropping 10 spots.
Right.
So they jumped to number 8 after beating Baylor. They beat Tulsa pretty good, moved up 2 spots to 6, struggled against Hawaii and only dropped to 7th. They killed Colorado State. They jumped back up to 5th. They barely beat Wyoming, only dropped to 7th after barely beating Wyoming. Yeah. Then they barely beat Air Force, and they still jumped to 5. They weren't number 1 until the final week. So I'm wondering who lost. So they beat Utah next to the last game by 10, and they were number 3 in the nation. So when they played Utah State, so week 10, I'm wondering if there was a bunch of losses by the big boys, because they went from 3, barely beat Utah, to number 1 in their last game against Utah State.
So it just was just a crazy year. And it's fun to look back on it, because looking back at a team that was a national champion that wouldn't stand a chance right now. They would probably get a group of 5 bid, because I think they're still going to do that with the 12-team playoff, but they would have to prove themselves a lot more than they did. And as much as it pains me to say it, being a Michigan fan, a team that was worthy, Michigan wasn't worthy even to get a bowl game that year. So, but I look at some of the awards, Jeff. The Heisman Trophy for 1984, we both know went to Doug Flutie. Robbie Bosco was a distant third. Who was sandwiched in between them?
Oh, I can't cheat.
You can cheat if you want. You'll like it.
I was going to look. Is it an Ohio State guy?
It is Keith Byers, running back for Ohio State. Yeah, he was second. And the ironic thing enough about that was there was, I'm looking at it right now, 4 quarterbacks. Chuck Long, the year before he won it. And there was Bernie Kosar was 4th. And then Kenneth Davis from Texas Christian was 5th. Then we had an offensive lineman that was in the top.
Oh, wow.
10. Remember Bill Fralick? He played for the Atlanta Falcons for quite a
I do.
year. He was from Pittsburgh. And I think he even dabbled in pro wrestling for a while. That's what I remember most about him too. But yeah, and then you had Jerry Rice and Reuben Mays in the top 10. Just some interesting tidbits from that year.
Wow. Oh boy, you took me back down memory lane with Keith Byers on that old original turf of Ohio Stadium. I used to love watching him run. This is interesting. I'm glad we're doing this, because I'm looking at some of these names, and that's, I got into football 5, 6, 7 years old, but this is around, I was turning 10 or 11, and I really got into football. So these names are some of the first names I ever heard when I was really into football. I mean, even Lomas Brown, I remember him, the offensive lineman from Florida. And there's Fralick that you just mentioned. But Doug Flutie, yeah.
I was a sophomore in college, and it was obviously being a Michigan fan. They're just that year. You just knew after they got beat that it just wasn't their year, and it just again was an odd year. And it's funny, you look back on it. Back then, Nebraska was in the Big 10 or the Big 12 or Big 8, I think, at the time, or whatever.
Right, 8, yeah.
And Texas was still in the Southwest Conference, and some of these teams that were independents, and Notre Dame was the hated rival. If you're not a Notre Dame fan, if Michigan played them, it just, and I'm not saying college football is any better or any worse back then, but it just, I don't know. It is fun to look back on, and that's kind of why we do this show, and kind of a retrospective of some of the games. And that's why I kind of wanted to maybe spotlight this team, because it was an unusual national championship run for a team,
It's so weird to me, even in the 80s, even before, things advanced with college football, for the leaders of the NCAA to allow a 6-5 team to play in a Holiday Bowl against the number 1 team in the nation, and the number 2 team in the nation playing against the number 10 team in the nation in a completely different bowl game a week or 2 later. I can't even think, what were they thinking? But I think the ties to bowl games back then was the most important thing. I don't know that teams, really cared to play. Oh, who's one, who's two, let's play it together. I think there was loyalty to whatever bowl game you were affiliated with, your conference. So, and that took precedence. And I'm glad it's not like that now.
Oh, I agree. How about back when, when I was watching college football, when you say you were 10 or 11, back in the 70s, when the Big Ten was only allowed to have one bowl representative, and you couldn't go to the Rose Bowl 2 straight years.
Oh, geez.
I don't know if you remember. You obviously don't remember that, but
no.
That created so much animosity around here. A quick history lesson was back. I'll never forget it. I was about 9, I think 8 or 9. And
I know what game you're going to say, I think.
Yeah, when you guys tied, when Michigan and Ohio State tied, and they had the vote of the ADs to who to send to the Rose Bowl, and Michigan State's AD had the tie-breaking vote, and he gave it to Ohio State. Boy, oh boy. Well, there we go. Just to look back at the Brigham Young Cougars from 1984 and kind of football in general back in 1984 was such a wild scene, as Jeff and I both had talked about with that. Brigham Young, of course, the number 1 team in the land, the only undefeated team in 1984, and such an interesting dynamic with the way that college football is right now. Their bowl game on December 21st against a 6-5 Michigan team that they trailed going into the fourth quarter. Teams did not want to play them in that bowl game because they were afraid it wasn't a marquee matchup. My, how things have changed 40 years later. So a great look back at the Brigham Young Cougars, champion in sports history in 1984, and want to thank Jeff Beck for taking time out to be with us and kind of doing a look back. Both of us learning a few things. That's kind of what we like to do here on the show. So again, thank you to everybody who takes time out to be with us. And a reminder that you can catch the audio recording of this on Apple Podcasts. So look us up, follow us on Apple Podcasts. All of these shows will be downloaded on that. You will see this downloaded later on this week, probably Thursday or Friday, May the 23rd. So keep an eye out for that. All right, that's going to do it for another edition of Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History, spotlighting the 1984 Brigham Young Cougars. For my guest today, Jeff Beck, yours truly, Captain Lou, saying keep your heads up, keep your sticks down, keep your feet moving, and as always, keep your minds open. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon for another edition of Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History. So long.